Hello and welcome to Maiden and Matriarch. My guest today is Julie Bindel, back again for a second appearance on the pod. She is an iconic radical feminist campaigner, a journalist, and author of many books, including her latest, which is called Lesbians, Where Are We Now? We spoke about why transgenderism may well be over, at least in the UK, and why Julie isn't minded to forgive the people who enabled the abuses of the movement. We also spoke about Julie's early experiences of activism, including pouring concrete down the loos in sex cinemas and picketing outside them, an early encounter she had with Mary Whitehouse, the challenges that radical feminists have had with allying with the Christian right, why the Christian right and radical feminists agree on certain very important things, and Muslim rape gangs in Britain, which were operating as early as the 1950s, in which Julie encountered growing up in Darlington in the 60s and 70s. All of that is in the extended version of the episode, which, as always, you can find at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find all the other stuff associated with the podcast, the essays I post on Substack, the chat community, etc. Another quick reminder that the young adult edition of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution is now available. This is the abridged version for a teenage audience. If you know any teenagers who you think would benefit from reading it, male or female, then please do think about buying them a copy. Julie, can I start by asking about the recent Supreme Court decision? Because I actually don't think I've discussed it on the podcast yet, even though it's been such a big event. And I am actually not the person to explain it. But you know the ins and outs.
Right. Well, I won't go into too much technical and legal detail.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that your subscribers know enough about the fact that this was a case taken against the Scottish ministers who were de facto running the ship as though self-identification for trans people was the law, and had decided that the Equality Act interpreted a trans person with a gender recognition certificate as, and we know we're talking about men who claim to be women, as, for all intents and purposes, in all circumstances, a legal woman, a certificated woman. And for Women Scotland had taken a case against them, and it had been through various courts. They'd lost, they'd won, Scottish ministers had appealed and won, and it ended up in the Supreme Court, which is really good, as it turns out, because that is obviously, as you will know from its name, the highest court in the UK, and it covers the whole of the UK. So this became a much bigger case. And the decision was, of course, that it ruled against the Scottish ministers and in favour of For Women Scotland and the interveners, which I'll talk about a little bit, and clarified the law and simply reiterated what was said in the Equality Act of 2010. No new law was made. It was simply this, that the Stonewall law that many institutions have been operating under, this law that trans women are women, that employers and institutions should ignore the Equality Act when it came to single-sex exemptions and spaces, it meant that Stonewall law had yet another nail in its coffin, and the law of the land was reaffirmed. So let's just go back to the actual hearing, which was a few months ago. I was in court representing the Lesbian Project, which Kathleen Stock and I run, and we were intervening as an interested party, as were the LGB Alliance and Scottish Lesbians and Sex Matters. So Sex Matters, I'm sure you can appreciate very straightforwardly, was saying sex matters in every aspect of life, in health, in education, in criminal justice, everywhere you go, it matters. And the lesbian groups were saying, we will effectively lose all our protections and right to assert our sexual orientation as same-sex attracted people, which meant to organise without the invasion of men, in the case of lesbians, if you go along with the Scottish Government ruling that this is about gender identity and gender expression and a gender recognition certificate. And in our submissions to the court, there was an absolutely superb line, which is, lesbians are attracted to other women, not to certificates. And so in the hearing, the Scottish government obviously had their case put forward, which is that some men can be lesbians if they are trans women and if they have a GRC. And the KC arguing the case for them, to say she was struggling is to put it very mildly. Eminent QC, I'm sure she's totally brilliant, but she was arguing that black is white and that the earth is flat. So she tripped herself up because you can't possibly coherently argue that. And particularly, you can't argue the opposite of the truth and of scientific biological reality in front of 5 of the best legal brains in the UK. So we all came back for the decision, which was on April the 16th, and I absolutely knew we had won. And I'm never optimistic in cases because I've seen so many terrible jury decisions, so many verdicts rather, so many terrible judicial decisions that have gone the wrong way. But I knew we had to win because it was so straightforward that what the Scottish ministers had done under Nicola Sturgeon was just decide that they would introduce self-identification. And this, as you know, has been going on across the land. And we don't have self-ID. So all that's happened is a clarification. But on the day that we were in court for the decision, it was instant jubilation. We had to keep quiet about it, followed by a complete relief. And for me, and I know many others that have been involved in this terrible war for so long, real anger, depression followed by anger, actually. What a waste of everybody's time. What a terrible toll it has taken. Women in prison, on children who've been medically sterilized and mutilated, on the parents of those kids, on women and men that have lost their jobs. A terrible, terrible toll. So the celebration, certainly for me, was very short-lived. And now I just want to go back to fighting things like rape and domestic abuse and femicide without having the liberal masses telling us that we can't do that because we're bigots. And anyway, these men committing these crimes are really women.
It's one of the things I thought reading your latest book, because it's part memoir, right? And you've been present at most of the most important feminist milestones in recent British history in one form or another. And up until, is it 2004 you wrote that Guardian column that, up until then your focus is on pornography, prostitution, violence against women in all forms, basically. Still is, obviously, but post 2004 all of a sudden you're having to sprint to stay still because just the terms of what even is a woman is suddenly up for debate, and that makes dealing with issues relating to women so much more difficult. So I know what you mean about the sense of anger at this verdict. It's that feeling of, well, Supreme Court decision. It's that feeling of, we knew this. The piece that I wrote in response to it, I titled, "It Turns Out Water is Wet."
Yes, I read it. It's excellent. Yeah.
And that is how it feels, isn't it?
It is. It is how it feels. And yet we had to fight this battle in the same way that in the 1980s and the 1990s, I remember those of us that were involved in this kind of feminist campaigning at the time had to fight the really nasty misogynistic men's rights groups that were insisting that women commit as many acts of domestic violence as do men, that children would be safer with abusive men than they would be with their mothers. All of these, we had this terrible backlash as we succeeded with legislation and with a groundswell of opinion. There came the men's rights activists. So all that trans activism is a misogynistic men's rights activist campaign. But it's different. It's much worse because, as you know, the liberal masses got on board, the upper middle class people with luxury beliefs who thought that having a trans-identified child was the latest fashion accessory because it had become boring having a lesbian or gay child. And they supported these people. They supported them against us. And I think what it did was it brought out a lot of feminist bigotry out of the woodwork. Those that had wanted to say, do you know, you're really irritating, you feminists. Or I find you lesbians quite creepy. Well, I mean, they're entitled to their opinion, but just be honest about it. And don't pretend to go along with an Orwellian view of the world that is so universally harmful just to get at us. But I think that people became so captured that we were forced, as you say, to swim against the tide for the simple reason that those of us that were in the kind of activism that you've been involved in and many others against pornography and the like, we were forced to deal with it head on because this prevented us from naming male violence for what it was. And it prevented us from protecting and defending women who had been victim to that abuse, that the girls and women vulnerable to that abuse, and also those that needed recovery time in women-only spaces and services, such as Edinburgh Rape Crisis, and we all know what happened there. So we were forced to, because I personally only became involved in this battle because of the threat of male violence and the mad theory that men could just identify their way out of patriarchy and out of their male persona, suddenly claimed to be women, and in a twist that was actually quite ingenious at the time, say that we, feminists, were the oppressors of these men. So we had to fight it. But I just felt like saying after that court case, as I was saying in 2004, because I didn't want to do this, not for a second. It wasn't fun. It's never been fun. The women I've met and some of the men that I've met, and my God, we've had to laugh at the ridiculousness of it. That's all part of it. But it has not been fun or good for any of us.
You said before that you're not optimistic generally, but how are you feeling about the future transgenderism, at least in Britain? Has this been the decisive victory?
I mean, I am optimistic generally as a person. I've had to be because obviously as a feminist campaigning to end rape, for example, I have to know, and I do know, boy babies are not born inherently bad. They are not programmed to grow up to be abusers or in any way wish to control the girls and women in their lives. And so I don't believe any of this is innate. So I am optimistic. I believe in change. I believe in rehabilitation. But I am very optimistic now that this is the beginning of the end. I know it is. I absolutely know that the Supreme Court decision isn't the be-all and end-all of what has put the lid on this horror. It's symbolic of where we were going and how it had to end, how it had to take away the unbridled power and arrogance of trans activists, some of whom are transgender identified, most of whom are not. They're simply in it for the fight because it's been an easy one for them. I know that Stonewall is now crumbling, and I blame Stonewall for shoring up an awful lot of the power and arrogance of this group, this ideology. So it is on the way out, and there will be some that cling on, a bit like those playing the violins as the Titanic went down. But it will end, and what will happen is that those that weren't exactly in the fight, but were too cowardly to speak out, but they could have done, and I'm thinking of high-profile, well-protected women and men who definitely could have spoken out, taken a bit of a hit, but survived, they will start pretending that they didn't ever believe this anyway. They'll start saying, well, it was all a bit mad, but I had a trans nephew.
Yeah.
And the way that I feel, and I don't really like the way I feel, but I'm just being honest about it. I will never forgive. I will never, ever, ever forgive those people. I absolutely will forgive those that went along on a tidal wave of this kind of cult following, this fugue state, and who recognized that, yeah, well, we were vulnerable to it and everybody was saying it. Of course, I forgive those people. I've had mad, crazy ideas and I'll have them again. But I won't forgive those privileged, cowardly, immoral idiots that let this terrible thing take its toll.
I've heard you say before that the number of people that you've had privately contact you, I guess since 2004, saying, I actually agree with you, but I can't possibly say so. And actually it reaches the point, I've heard this from other people as well, it reaches the point where you think, you know what, bugger you.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. I used to be quite gracious, maybe up till about 10 years ago. I used to say, thank you for that. And yes, of course, I know there are reasons why others can't. And I saw myself as almost like a bit of a kind of infallible punch bag. Well, it's, I spoke out. I didn't have to. Well, I've got a public profile. Well, I come out with statements about men that are quite unpopular, or yes, I understand that if others don't defend me when I'm deplatformed from a panel that they're also on, they've got work to do. They don't want it all to crumble. So I used to really try and be magnanimous. And then I stopped. I would just write back and say, can you explain to me why you can't speak out? Because I haven't quite got it. And especially seeing all of those women that really had a lot to lose, that didn't have a safety net of wealth and privilege, didn't have, I've got a nice house, I have a great life with a very happy relationship and a good career. I was lucky in that I didn't lose money. I just lost the opportunity to do my activism a lot of the time. And of course, I lost brain cells through stress. But so many of the women that have taken cases because they've had to, including those that contact me who are cleaners in hospitals who are being disciplined right now, but who dare not, they can't afford a lawyer and they daren't speak out. Well, they're speaking out. Why can't others? Why can't those that I know agree with me when nothing terrible is going to happen to them? And if they start speaking out now and doing the whole, yes, of course, I'm glad that the Supreme Court ruled this way because we needed clarification. I swear to God, I will not stay silent. Let's just put it that way. I want people to change their minds. I change my mind all the time. I want them to change their minds and not be bullied for it. But the hypocrites and the ones that are now going to try to defend their own reputations, no.
Christianity is, in the words of Tom Holland, the most disruptive, the most influential, and the most enduring revolution in history. And we are all children of this revolution, whether we go to church or not. That's why it makes sense to get to grips with Christian faith, whatever your background. And 321 is a fantastic way to do that. 321 is an online course presented by Glenn Scrivener, who you might know from this podcast. It's engaging, imaginative, and assumes no prior knowledge. Binge it in a couple of hours or take your time over 8 sessions. It's completely free. Go to 321course.com/MMM, enter your email, set a password, and you're in. No spam, no cost, just an invitation to look at life again through the lens of Jesus. Whether you're looking for an introduction to Christianity for yourself or looking to introduce others, find out more for free at 321course.com/MMM. I met a woman when I was in Australia recently who is I won't name her, but she's a politician who's been very good on this and has spoken out against transgenderism to her cost. And we were talking about the fact that Australia is kind of behind Britain in this regard, as are other countries. They seem to have not got the memo that this is all nuts, and so it's going to take hopefully it won't take that long, but at the moment, like the institutional power behind this is pretty stunning. And I said, I'm sorry to say that you're probably in the like 2004 Julie Bindel phase.
Oh God.
But the good news is it won't. One, the good news is it won't last, because I really
Mm,
do think that this movement is so vulnerable just on its own terms.
mm,
It's so incoherent. The people running it are
mm.
so crazy. It's so dysfunctional. It asks way too much of the public. It asks people to deny the truth of their own eyes. It can't last.
Yes,
So that's the good news. The bad news is that no one is going to say sorry. Almost no one is going to say sorry.
that's absolutely right. And it's a little bit like the sexual revolution. For some, it was beneficial. It sounded like the language of liberation. I mean, as you've written about eloquently, it harmed an awful lot of women, and not just women. What have we got at the end of it? No revolution, no liberation. And we're having to start again and pick the little bits out that perhaps were good and women definitely benefited from. But looking at the massive destruction and the lies that were told is what's painful. And that not only were there no apologies, there was a looking down their noses at, well, you must be prudes, you must be anti-sex harridans, then you don't understand. And this is what happens, isn't it, when women speak out against something that is so terrible, but that the other side, and it's not often a war like this has been a war, but those that should know better but refuse to see it, such as with prostitution or surrogacy, they
Mm.
just continue to insist that they are right. And it doesn't matter how much harm and damage they see around them, how much misery, how this escalates and becomes out of control. They still don't apologise. The tobacco industry apologised. I mean, it took a long time, but there
Mm.
was an apology.
What do you think it is about you in terms of your personality that's not only led you to do this work for your whole adult life, but that you seem well, I'm going to say you seem able to withstand it in terms of everything that people throw at you. Do you think that there must be something kind of unusual in a good way about you? Can you see what it is?
Uh, I don't think I can withstand it. I think I refuse to let the enemy see me crumble because, I mean,
Mm,
they have seen me crumble, of course. I have caved in and crumbled, and those tiny moments, those rare moments, are used against me again by those that should know better in a quite a cruel way, I think. So I'm definitely not thick-skinned. I'm very thin-skinned, and it's it it really does affect me quite badly. But I've been really lucky as well, because when this started for me, although it did feel very lonely because it was public, I didn't have to lose friends, except for friendly colleagues at The Guardian, and that didn't happen till further down the line, probably about 10 years later. And then I did lose some women that I thought were actually friends. But all of my real friendship network just completely agreed with me, of course, because they were all feminists, understanding the relevance of sex-based rights, understanding how these men will use any tactics they can to access vulnerable women, that those men that are, now we understand the term autogynephiliac, we've seen them in other guises as well. And so they all got it. So there was never a time when I had to sit at dinner or at a friend's house or after the cinema or whatever and say, by the way, girls, I'm in trouble for saying this. Now hear me out because you might be offended by it. There was none of that for me. Everyone was just, oh, for Christ's sake, this again. Is this still going on? And the other thing is, and I have to be honest about this because it occurred to me recently when I thought, why haven't I just thrown myself off a bridge? Why aren't I a quivering wreck in some mental institution? And it's because I'm in a really good relationship with someone who is extremely supportive, and that counts for a huge, huge amount. And I cannot deny the significance of that in my life. So I'm lucky.
I mean, because the thing that actually scares people sometimes a lot more than professional or financial costs is the social costs. And it sounds like one of the things that you did, I'm sure unwittingly, is that you sort of designed your friendship group and indeed your romantic life such that no one was going to cancel you for this. Like the relationships that mattered were not vulnerable
Yes.
to this craziness.
Yes. And although I did have friendships in the professional sphere with people that possibly would be a bit on the trans train, or some that were of the, well, sex work, I just never spoke to them about that because we were never close friends. We were pals, and we were, like I say, you know, we'd go on press trips together, and that was all fine. But the other thing, I think, is that what I had to do from quite early on, when the accusations of bigotry came in, is I had to face it head on and stop it from really doing my head in. Because if you're fighting, and I have my faults are legion, I've got many, many faults, I've done lots of things wrong, but effectively all of my adult life I have campaigned for the rights of women and girls, and I've been on, and I never use this phrase, I'm using it ironically, the right side of history about those things, and have spent a lot of my unpaid time campaigning to that end. So when they start throwing things like Nazi, bigot, homophobe, and they do it without a touch of irony, and it becomes a truism for the students that are trying to force you off campus, you know, and I'm trying to go through and do a talk, and they're screaming, you're a transphobe, you're a homophobe, you're a bigot. And you think, well, but this is going to send me mad. This is going to actually really be the thing that drives me mad, because it's the opposite of what I am. And you can't get through to them because they're a cult and they've never read anything I've written, because that would be triggering for them. And so I was able to then just accept this was a cult. They were mad. They were infected by a madness. And do not believe them. Do not take this seriously. Yes, it's hurtful, but know that they are crazy. I had to.
You've been taking that view for a long time. I mean, before this came along, because what's clear from reading your account of your early life is that this strong sense of I'm not going to back down in the face of this has been with you since you were a teenager.
I think the way I was raised was really important, because living in a working class housing estate in the northeast of England, where we were the forgotten tribe, really. No government, actually, ironically, until Tony Blair came along, no member of parliament in that region ever gave a damn about actual working class people in the northeast. And so I was always aware of a sense of injustice, and therefore of right and wrong, because my dad was a union activist, and my mum was always vocal about the fact that working class people were looked down on and given short shrift compared to the middle class families at the other side of the town. And so it was class really that started me thinking about injustice. And then I was really lucky, because when I think I was about 12, a program called Shoulder to Shoulder was screened. I think it was ITV. Either way, we only had 3 channels. So we watched everything that was broadcast. And this was about the suffragettes. And it was very accessible. It was easy for me to digest. And I realised that actually not just were there women doing direct action, which always seemed really romantic to me, like how fantastic that they use their physical selves to block things from happening to women, but that also when women did win the vote, it wasn't for all women. Of course, working class women were left behind. And so I thought, gosh, this really is bad. So I knew by this time that I wasn't interested in boys, that I was a lesbian and that I wasn't going to be a closeted lesbian, and that the world was my oyster, really, because out there were women, there were girls and women who were living lives without being locked up or executed, and that this was possible. So I think that was it. It's not necessarily anything. I mean, I developed a strong spirit. I developed the courage I needed to live that life, but I don't think it was anything special about me. I think it was a set of circumstances and me being determined to get away from that housing estate. As I say, a happy, loving family, but I needed to be away from it so that I didn't end up being in an unhappy marriage with a man and not choosing if and when I had children, and then living a life where I couldn't afford any other option and there was no real escape. So in a way, it was quite a selfish move, but I'm really glad that I did it. And because, of course, I met the feminists who, most of whom were lesbians by the time I was 17.
When did you become involved in activism?
As soon as I met the feminists in Leeds, I was newly arrived from staying with an aunt in North Yorkshire trying to find some work. There was no work in Darlington where I grew up. I had a girlfriend who I'd met and she worked in Leeds. And I thought, okay, we'll move there together. And we moved there to the Young Women's, what's it, the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. I'm not sure they still exist. I think they might. But either way, we couldn't afford...
Women's version of the YMCA.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So we lived there. And I immediately met the feminists because I went to the alternative bookstore, which was in our area, which was near the university. And it had posters all over the shop. You know, these alternative bookshops, they're great. And there was a leaflet saying, we're putting together a newsletter of it had a very cumbersome title, the Revolutionary and Radical Feminist Newsletter. And I thought, oh, I can do that. I always had wanted to write, so I thought I'd go along to that meeting. And it was so alien. It was really quite off-putting because it was this drafty old house, probably a squat. And they had food I didn't recognise at all. I mean, there was this dry old wholemeal bread on the table, and I was used to plastic wrapped Mother's Pride. And, they were cooking vegan curry with ingredients I'd never seen. And there were bicycles in the hallway that you would trip over. And the women were all quite hippie-ish and alternative and therefore probably a bit standoffish. But then as I got to know them, more and more of the younger working class women came along because they were all about 15 years older than me, the original lot that I first met. I just thought, well, this is my tribe because they're all talking about direct action. They're all saying it as it is. They're swearing and saying men are bastards. There's a sex cinema down the road and you can see the dirty old bastards going into it. And I thought, yeah, right, okay, this is quite my thing. And then I just slid into it and started picketing the sex cinemas. Gosh, don't they sound archaic now? Cinemas.
I've never understood it. So men would... I kind of get the concept, but that men would go to these places and they'd just wank in the presence of other wanking men.
Yeah, so this was, obviously, there's an age gap between us. So I'm 62. So thinking about as a young activist when I was 18, 19, so end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 80s, it was pre-VHS.
Yeah.
So you didn't have videos in your home. Probably VHS existed or Beta, whatever the other one was, but you didn't have a video player in your home. So men that wanted to watch pornography as opposed to just read pornography in Hustler or Playboy would go to these sex cinemas. And it's incredible, isn't it? The lack of stigma and shame that they would go in. We'd be standing outside photographing them and shouting at them and the like. And I suppose, they would sit and wank in the presence of other men. What can I tell you?
They can't have been that well frequented.
I don't know. They didn't. The one that we pictured didn't last long. But then, of course, it went a bit mainstream because you had something called video nasties.
What were
Have you heard
those?
about them?
I've heard the
So,
expression, but I don't really know what it means.
right, so they were the most classic one was "I spit on your grave," and they had rape scenes in there with a pretend narrative, like
Uh-huh.
how pornography used to have. The plumber would turn up to fix the washing machine, and she'd open the door in a negligee. Now, of course, it's just hardcore fucking from the second that you open the frame. But they were a bit more mainstream, pretending to be something that it wasn't. And then, of course, the Linda Lovelace films, where we know that she was terribly abused on set. And we started then to picket those films that were shown in independent cinemas because we thought this was outrageous. And we went in and we threw eggs at the screen, and we put cement down the loos so that all the loos stopped working. And we did some really good direct action against. There was a strip joint that opened, and then of course we'd go outside the sex shops, the stores that sold pornographic magazines, and we're starting to have very expensive imported VHS or beta, whatever it was, mainly from the Netherlands. And so we would picket that. We would go on the marches against anti-abortion legislation that was coming in, and whatever else was happening, we were a visible presence. And it was quite interesting because Mary Whitehouse came to speak at Leeds University. I didn't go to university till I was much older as a mature student, but some of the feminist activists that I hung around with were at Leeds University. Mary Whitehouse came to speak, and we went along there to challenge her because, of course, we were concerned that she was saying that lesbians and gays or same-sex attracted people were bad for society and were going around abusing children. And it's only further down the line, particularly with Samira Ahmed's work on Mary Whitehouse, that I have realised that some of that just wasn't true. I mean, there were still things I fundamentally disagreed with her at that time. Obviously, she was a woman of her time, her class, and her faith. But I think I just went along there thinking, well, this is a woman who's against us. And it was halfway through her talk that I thought, actually, she's talking about pornography and about how mainstream it's becoming. And this is making sense. But I didn't dare say anything because I was a young activist, not that confident. I'd never read a book on this. And I do look back at that and really wish that I'd been an older, wiser person listening to her.
I think Mary Whitehouse is so interesting in this regard because I don't think there's any doubt that she really was homophobic. I think that one of the first things that she ever wrote for the Times, maybe, or Sunday Times, was
Yeah.
about like how to stop your son becoming gay. So I think it's quite hard to
Yes, to
erase that
deny
part
it.
of her history, indeed.
Yeah.
But yeah, she was really on it with porn, and she was really on it with paedophilia, and she stood up to an awful lot of abuse in the same way that you did. And yeah, she has been partially vindicated.
And I think it's fine that I wish that we could relearn being able to appreciate that people are not one-dimensional characters, that you sometimes disagree with each other, or even that sometimes someone is just plain wrong. But that doesn't make everything that they believe in or stand up for or talk about similarly wrong. And it's not even nuanced. It's surely just human nature that we should be able to appreciate that and speak on that level.
And this is a long-standing tricky issue, right? The fact that radical feminists and conservative Christians agree on some things, right? Not
Maybe
just
for different
porn.
reasons, but yeah.
Well, that's the thing, right? But it's so not just porn, but also prostitution, also surrogacy. There's quite a long list of things, and I know that this has often been a slightly vexed issue for you because on the one hand, you want to be them as effective as possible, but then you will get criticised sometimes for working too closely with the conservative Christians.
The Christian right and some radical feminists in the US didn't ever really form an allegiance, although the rumour had it that the likes of Andrea Dworkin, quote unquote, marched with the Christian right. And that isn't the case because the Christian right, which we don't have in the UK, were opposed to basic rights for women. That was the argument. And I did believe that then, and I do believe it now. But of course, it's possible to form allegiances with, or coalition with, or sit on the same panel with those that are, for example, on the surrogacy issue, saying these are the harms to the women and to the children if this market is left unchallenged. And I don't hear anything different, for example, from what Jennifer Lyle is saying, who has also argued to restrict abortion, which I disagree with her fundamentally on that, then what I would say, because surely it's not a left or right position to care about the welfare of children, to recognise that a woman being used as a breeding machine is wholly immoral, unethical, and dangerous. So I have no problem with that, because I just see those people as having sensible views on human rights abuses. Now, if a individual with whom I disagree politically was arguing that we should all oppose pornography as long as I sign up to their strategy to reverse the abortion rights for women, or to reverse legislation for lesbian and gay equality, well, that would be a different matter. But I do think that if we're honest with each other about the positions that we take, and some of those are faith-based and some of them are not, but we really do want to inhabit a world where women and their children are not seen as merchandise, then I'll do that.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.